Welcome, everyone, to our viewing and discussion of Strange Fruit, brought to you by the Valley Outreach Synagogue, Anti-Racism Task Force, and Zahra Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. My name is Kiyomi Kowalski, and I chair both the Valley Outreach Synagogue Social Justice Collective and the Anti-Racism Task Force. The mission and vision statements of the Valley Outreach Synagogue Anti-Racism Task Force is to end racism, bigotry, and prejudice in our community and beyond. In an effort to advance the goal of anti-racism both individually and systemically, the task force provides opportunities for people to better understand the underlying causes and effects of racism and engage in earnest dialogue and self-reflection that challenges prevalent assumptions, understandings of race, and the systems that reinforce racial inequality. The Anti-Racism Task Force envisions a world unencumbered by the effects of individual racism, systemic racism, and racial inequality. The task force will leverage community partnerships such as this to provide non-judgmental and supportive educational opportunities to explore personal awareness of racism by providing workshops, panels, and discussions. As you will learn tonight, this poem and song, written by a white Jewish man and sung most famously by a Black woman, highlights the historic. Was I muted?
Just at that 1 second, you ended with highlights the historic.
Okay, well, let's go on. Yeah, so this highlights the historic significance of the relationship between Black and Jewish Americans as co-conspirators and allies in their joint struggle for civil rights. This conversation is especially important in this moment when we find division in the Black and Jewish communities far too often. Additionally, we are excited to announce that the VOS Social Justice Collective, which includes this task force, as well as Environment and Power Task Force, is officially adding the Against Anti-Semitism Task Force to support efforts in fighting anti-Jewish sentiment and hate. As chair of the Social Justice Collective, I know how important it is to assemble the right team. I want to thank Laura Blatt, Brendan Wolstatter, and Kathy Belsky for volunteering their time to join this team. These women put in many hours to bring this event to us tonight. Thank you. I also knew it was important to recruit a chair for this new initiative who understands education about anti-Semitism in the way I understand education about racism. And Robin Weber generously volunteered her time to chair the Against Anti-Semitism Task Force. Her and her beautiful family are members of the Valley Outreach Synagogue community, and she lives, sleeps, and breathes this work at Zahra. I should also disclose that Robin happens to be a close friend whom I trust, and I am thrilled to have the opportunity to learn from her and work with her on the Against Anti-Semitism Task Force. Robin?
I am Robin Weber, Communications Director of the Zahra Holocaust Remembrance Foundation and a member of the Valley Outreach Synagogue, which, thank you, Kiyomi. I am honored to chair the Against Anti-Semitism Task Force for our community. Tonight, we introduce you to the incredible story of Strange Fruit. It began in the 1930s as a poem, but its words and melody tugged at the hearts and minds of a diverse public. Through this song and its many voices, most notably Billie Holiday, Strange Fruit became an anthem for a movement, finally bringing attention to the brutal reality and barbarity of lynching in the United States. Please note, we do have some schools here and students here. The preceding program does contain scenes of extreme violence. Viewer discretion is advised. Following this 1-hour documentary, we are honored to have with us the person who created it, producer, director, and editor, Joel Katz. Joel is the creator of multiple documentaries regarding all kinds of stories about people, ancestry, life, and economic class. Joel is also a professor in the Media Arts Department of New Jersey City University. We also have here today civil rights leader, Dr. Robert L. Green, Dean and Professor Emeritus of the Urban Affairs Program at Michigan State University. Dr. Green holds so many positions and honors. I won't list them all here, but please know he has devoted his life to social and educational justice. He was also Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s education director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and has carried on that work through the present and into the future. In addition, he just completed his autobiography, At the Crossroads of Fear and Freedom, a memoir on the fight for social and educational justice. So fitting for this program. We are privileged to have both Joel and Robert here. Thank you. And lastly, we have Ralph Krause from Edutainment, where he brings history makers to the classrooms virtually. Tonight, he is our tech support, AKA Questions, our chat guy. So I ask from all of you, as you watch the documentary, record the emotions, your emotions, thoughts, and questions that may come up for you. Then place your questions in that chat box below for our panel discussion later. But before we get started, let me tell you a little about Zahor and what I do. Zahor means remember. We are dedicated to spreading awareness to never forget. Our mission is to preserve the memory of the Holocaust through a myriad of educational tools and outreach programs for teachers, students, and history enthusiasts, such as yourselves. Because education is so important, we recently launched the first ever Holocaust educational site taught by a survivor, Ben Lesser, who not only is here tonight, but happens to be the founder of the organization and my grandfather. Our curriculum was designed for teachers, by teachers, and currently being utilized by many educational institutions worldwide. The URL will be posted in the chat box should you want to learn more. But Zahor is much more than just remembering the past. It's about not repeating. When we educate, we promote tolerance, respect, and diversity, all while advocating change and teaching the values of acceptance and peace. Let me share with you a little something about our organization.
My dear departed one, all 6 million of them are crying out to the world in a single word. Zahor, remember us. We were here. Don't forsake us. If you don't want to have another Holocaust in the world, you have to talk about it. Nazis did not start with killing. They started with hate. Once love and respect was eradicated by hate, it was easy to kill. I have dedicated my life to end this hatred. When we educate, we can prevent, and then we will ultimately prevail.
Never Forget is the driving force behind the Zahor Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. We are dedicated to ensuring the remembrance of the Holocaust with community-building efforts designed to guide positive change. Our mission is to make sure the Holocaust never happens again. Education is the gateway to prevention, and we provide tools for curriculum-based Holocaust studies, which teaches the virtues of perseverance, all while promoting peace and acceptance.
Now, more than ever, Zahor needs your support to continue our mission through educational programs, events, and awareness to never again.
To learn more about Zahor and Ben, please visit our site at zahorfoundation.org, also placed in the chat box. But without any further ado, I introduce Joel Katz's film, Strange Fruit. Wow, I'm speechless, which is why I'm going to jump straight to the panel discussion. Just to reintroduce you to our audience, the director of this film, Joel Katz, is here with us today, along with Dr. Robert L. Green, a civil rights activist. Together, they will engage in a Q&A discussion about the film and its relevance to our social and political climate today. So to start, Joel, what a powerful film. What inspired you to want to create this documentary?
Well, first, I want to just say thank you to you, Robin, and you, Kiyomi, and Zahra, and Dr. Green for being on this. I really appreciate, and whoever's out there in the audience, thank you for joining us. Yeah, so the genesis of the film was in 1995, a biographer named Stuart Nicholson published a new biography of Billie Holiday. And in that biography, he mentions Strange Fruit and mentions Lewis Allen, which is Abel Meeropol's writing name, but didn't really explain the circumstances of the song's authorship. And he kind of just mentioned it rhetorically. And I didn't actually read the book at the time, but Michael and Robbie Meeropol wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times Book Review explaining the story. And it was a short letter. It was just like a couple of column inches, but it actually eventually my film almost followed the structure of that letter. They explained who Abel Meeropol was, and then by about the third paragraph, and they say like kind of, oh, by the way, he was our adoptive father. Our birth parents were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So part of it was, well, when I saw that, I thought, like, as a nonfiction documentary filmmaker, you can't make things like this up. It's like being handed this unbelievable story. But the way it came to me was a friend of mine handed me that clipping, saying, Joel, I think you'll be interested in this. She knew some of my family history, which was that my father, who was a white Jew from Brooklyn, spent most of his professional career as a professor at Howard University. So I and he started there in 1968, a very controversial year, and taught there until 1986. So I kind of grew up with a lot of the turmoil and static of Black-Jewish relations around me. So this friend was quite correct that when I ran across this story of Strange Fruit's origins, it would be of great interest to me. So that's how it got started.
Wow, no, thank you, Dr. Katz. I do a lot of anti-racism work and inclusion work in the Jewish community. And what I hear a lot from people is comparing the Jewish experience with the Black experience. And I'm interested, Dr. Robert Green, if our synagogue members want to fight both anti-Semitism and racism, what biases do we need to address head on in order to do that effectively? And then what areas do we need to be sensitive to so that we do not wrongly equate the historical African-American experience with that of the historical Jewish experience? And where can we actually find common ground there and a common experience?
You can find common ground between the two. It became obvious to me that when I worked for Martin Luther King Jr., incidentally, I took a leave from Michigan State University at his request to work in the Deep South for voter registration. And it was at that time that, of course, we needed people to support voting rights in the South at that time. We needed fundraisers. And Martin Luther King Jr. was very, and I might add Harry Belafonte too, but really Martin Luther King Jr. was a person that people rallied around to deal with the question of voting rights, human rights. And among them were Jewish, well, I would say two Jewish men I knew very well, Harry Wachtel and Stanley Levinson, both out of New York City, were probably, along with Harry Belafonte, the major fundraisers for Martin Luther King Jr. when we went to jail. when 5,000 school children in Birmingham, Alabama were arrested and jailed by the way they studied the civil rights movement while they were locked up in jail. It was Harry Wachtell and Sandy Levinson who so kindly raised funds to eventually bail these kids out. So there was always a relationship between the Black and the Jewish community during the 60s. That's when I was most active in the South, was during the 60s. And so the Harry Wachtells, the Sandy Levinsons of the world, they were the ones who would always back us up. We knew we had support from the Jewish community. And it wasn't always just money. Money was very important. Bailing people out of jail was important. But it's that commitment to human rights and social justice, making sure that people did not brutalize you simply because you were Black. That the sheriff, Suggs Ingram in Grenada, Mississippi, didn't brutalize you and lock you up just because you were Black. And that did happen in those days.
Thank you, Dr. Green. So just to expand on that a bit, so what are the common historical common experiences between the Black and Jewish community, and what are the things that aren't so common? I think when we're trying to address, and this is my experience, I'd love to hear, of course, yours, trying to address anti-Semitism specifically requires different solutions and different treatment than trying to address racism. And so where are the common ground with the historical reference between the Jewish American experience and the Black American experience, if that helps?
I think the common experience centered around the fact that we were always looked upon as not really full-blooded Americans, if I might use that term. Discrimination against the Jewish community was common in many ways to discrimination in the Black community. Stereotyping, as a psychologist, I'm aware of how stereotypes can be invented, reinforced, and used to subjugate people. So the stereotyping of Jews and the stereotyping of Blacks was one common factor that those who were in favor of oppression used to hold us down. I think the unique aspect, or I should say the unique aspect between the two, the Jewish community, over the years, I felt had a stronger push behind them or support behind them from an educational standpoint. Education was so powerful and so important. You know, schools like Morehouse and Spelman created and turned out people like C.T. Vivian, John Lewis, who were great scholars and workers, Julian Bond, as an example, in the civil rights movement. That was a strength the Black community, I think, used and propelled education. In the Jewish community, education was always important. And so that the commonality would be a focus on education. I think that as I look historically upon change, and I have a copy of my book here, At the Crossroads of Fear and Freedom. I don't know if that's coming through.
We see it.
Can you see? I'm marketing this now.
I love it. Shameless plug.
The one thing I think that the Jewish community and the Black community had in common was what Martin Luther King Jr. talked about, was overcoming fear. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, and I was kind of shocked when he first said it, I was there, when he said, if you're afraid of dying, maybe you don't need to be living, or something to that effect. it wasn't that quite that harsh. But what he felt was that you needed to be willing to fight for freedom. And I think that's one thing that the Black and Jewish community has in common. We saw an indignity later on. We were prepared to fight it and work against it. And if Martin Luther King Jr. didn't do anything else, this he did. He taught the Black community. He taught women nowadays in our society to overcome fear and fight for freedom. And as I said at the beginning, and I hope I'm not repeating myself, I might be. I have a son monitoring me. And he said the older I get, the more I repeat myself. So I might be repeating this. But my dad talked about fear. He was always preaching, he was a minister, against fear. And finally I said to him, Dad, why do you always talk about fear? And then later on, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about fear. Fear was used to subjugate people, to hold them down, to keep them from voting, to keep them from the polls. And fear was instilled by Blacks in a very brutal way in America, in a very brutal way. My friend C.T. Vivian, who just died a short time ago, said, like Martin Luther King Jr., you really don't have a lot to fear but losing your life. And King used to say all the time, if you don't have anything that you will fight for, well, then maybe you're not ready to really live a full life. One quick point about Martin Luther King Jr. and fear. We were in Grenada, Mississippi in the fall of 1966. And Coretta Scott King, cousin was driving the car. I was in the back seat with Andrew Young. Martin Luther King Jr. was sitting in the front of the car. We pulled up to a gas station. A white man by the name of James Belk was pumping gas. He owned the Texaco station. He saw the car stop at the light. He ran up to the car, pulled out a pistol, and put it up against King's head and said, Martin, I'm going to blow your damn brains out. Martin Luther King Jr. turned to him and said, brother, I love you. He was stunned. He didn't know how to handle love. He put the pistol away. That to me was an example of the leadership and the fearlessness of Martin Luther King Jr. That's the commonality in the Jewish community. There are Jewish heroes who fought for freedom and struggled for freedom. And we can't forget them. Can't forget them at all.
Thank you for wow. I just have to say that I'm taking notes as I'm the Against Anti-Semitism chair for BOS. So I'm definitely taking notes. And one of the very things that I've been talking about with them is that we have to really distinguish the differences. And one of them happens to be the stereotypes, which is a commonality. And I agree with you at 100%. And this will follow the next question, actually, because it gets into it a little bit deeper. So the Holocaust was not in the US. Jews fled the Holocaust to reach safety here versus being taken from freedom and brought to the US into captivity. And although anti-Semitism continues today, it is not systemic the way racism is. What kind of connection can we make between the two events, between the Holocaust and the treatment of African Americans in America?
Well, let me say this. That commonality basically is the denial of human rights and total injustice, which sometimes led to the loss of life. That was a common factor. The other common factor was that in both communities, there always emerged men and women. And I say women in a very strong way because sometimes we don't give the Septima Clarks and Jewish women the kind of credit that we should give them in the struggle for human rights and social justice. So the commonality is the struggle to overcome fear and fight for freedom. And that's what Martin Luther King Jr., who's sitting right behind me, that's what he pushed for us to do. I can't think of anything more important than the complete understanding of social injustice by both communities. We always knew that racism was bad. We knew that lynchings were bad. We know that the denial of the right to vote was bad. We also knew there were ways to deal with it. Sometimes we felt we didn't have the power or the strength or the courage to deal with it. But thank God there were people like Joel Katz, who I've been reading about your background, and others who have come to the forefront to fight and struggle for social justice in America.
So on that point, because we were talking about that question, I'd like to invite someone who's here today. I introduced him briefly earlier. He is the founder of Zahor Holocaust Remembrance Foundation, also my grandfather, who happens to be a survivor of the Holocaust. And I think it would be great to get his perspective of the differences and the parallels and the commonalities between systemic racism and the Holocaust. Ben, are you still here?
He's got to unmute himself.
We just need to unmute you.
There he goes.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but it's the perfect question to bring you in.
Of course, I understand. Robert put it beautifully. I don't think there's a difference between the Jewish hate or the hate against Black racism, against Black people or other races. It doesn't matter to me. To me, hate is hate. Hitler and the Nazis did not start with killing. It all started with hate. Hate, propaganda, this is how it began. So the hatred has to stop. We are all God's creation. So why can't we live side by side and appreciate our differences rather than hate them? We're human beings. Doesn't matter whether different color, different race, different religion, we're all part of humanity. So let's live side by side. We have to fight this. And this is what I've been doing for the last 25 years, going around to schools and talking to kids, trying to make them understand. Now, I understand that a lot of this hatred comes from parents. You know, they talk about it and their kids hear it. And unless it's going to be taught in the schools that
right,
you can't hate, you stop the hatred. And a lot of the things, so the next generation might turn out to be the same as the parents. So this is where our fight is, Robert, yours and mine, to educate the world, and especially the youngsters. Let them know. Unfortunately, many schools don't teach about those things. They just don't teach it. They have all kinds of excuses, and that's wrong. And this is what you and I are working on, to try to get this world to come together and tell the world history. I mean, the Holocaust was history. What happened to the Black people was history. You can't omit that or skip it. It has to be taught. And it all comes from hate. So the hatred has to stop. And it doesn't matter whether you hate for whatever reason. Hate is hate. Even if you bully someone in school, that's a form of hate.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. No, I thank you so much. I could listen to you all day. The work that you do is incredible, and the fact that you and Dr. Green work together to prevent hate and educate us around hate is so critical, and your voices are so necessary in this. I'd like to take a second to hear from Joel and see if, from your perspective, if you have any ideas about solutions and treatments for hate, whether it be anti-Semitism or anti-Black racism. What from your perspective, treatments need to be done to help prevent it? I know education is a major piece, but yeah, what do you see?
Yes, I mean, education is huge, and I am an educator myself. And it's hard to follow in the footsteps of Dr. Green and Mr. Lesser, who are, doing such incredible work, and my sort of honored elders. I think in this discussion, one thing that's, I think, caution should be exercised about comparing the Holocaust and the African American experience, in that, both the Holocaust and the Middle Passage and 250 years of slavery were both horrific acts beyond comprehension. But they're in dialogues like this. Sometimes I not in this one tonight, but I mean more broadly, there sometimes is like almost a competition of suffering, and I think we should avoid that. And look towards constructive ways to work together. I think Dr. Green's work and Mr. Lesser's work really, and Zekor's work, exemplify that. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah. Go ahead, Robin.
Oh, no, that was just beautifully said.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely beautiful. We don't want to be in the oppression Olympics, as they say. Oh, I was hurt more than you. I think where I'm coming from is I see hate as one general thing, but each thing requires its own solution. Like when I speak to the ADL, they talk about anti-Semitism in a very different way than they'll talk about anti-Black racism or racism of all types. So I think there's different treatments, right? Because we've got in anti-Semitism, we've got the tropes that people don't realize that they fall into when discussing Jews as a culture. And we've got the stereotypes, of course, and that are common ground. So if there's any ideas tonight around the best strategic ways to target both, because if you talk to the ADL, anti-Semitism is a punching up, so to speak, which is a bit different than what you see with anti-Black racism in this country. So I'll move on, but what can those of us today do who are participating in this event to educate specifically around race and racism? I know that Zahra Foundation does a lot. What are your strategies? And anti-Semitism also.
I think we can encourage curriculum directors in school districts throughout the country to talk about openness, honesty, and anti-discrimination. We don't hold those discussions enough. I'm not saying we need to hold them in such a way that we penalize and beat people up and make them feel guilty. That's not what I mean. But there is a way in which we can talk about discrimination from a curriculum standpoint, from a social studies standpoint, at the junior high school and high school level, that will allow young people to become more open-minded. Because, there's a lot we don't know about discrimination that has occurred within a group other than our own, you know? And when people become aware of what has happened in the past, they sometimes will become more open-minded. So looking at ways to deal with the Associate Superintendent for Curriculum for the Los Angeles schools, the Associate Superintendent for Curriculum with the Detroit schools is saying, hey, this has to be taught. To let people know that America is a great country, but it has not always been a very open country in terms of how we've treated people. And I'm not talking about it from any political standpoint. I'm talking about it from a human rights standpoint, because a lot of kids just don't know. I did not know about the treatment, this is another group, of the Japanese during World War II until I sat next to a young Japanese student at San Francisco State College. And at break time, we would sit outside and talk. He tutored me on how the Japanese were relocated I never knew that. And I thought I was a good student, but I just didn't know. So sometimes knowledge can break through prejudice. Ben Lesser told me some things that Ben Lesser told me, I think, Ben, and I see you there, so if I'm not accurate, you can go right ahead and correct me, and I'll tell you you're wrong. Ben Lesser told me that he was in a camp, Auschwitz. Is that correct, Ben?
Yes.
And that
yes.
he said the first time he saw a black man was standing over him with a rifle saying, "Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you. I'm here to help you." It was a black soldier. That made such an impact. That not only made an impact on Ben, it made an impact on me. Ben, I've told that story 100 times. I've told that story to college students, to high school students, that when I saw black soldiers breaking the locks on the gates to Auschwitz, that blew me away. Mm-hmm. You know, so there are a lot of things we can share with young people that can turn them in the right direction. So Ben Lesser educated me. You know, I thought I knew a little bit, but Ben Lesser taught me a lot.
Thank you.
About Black-Jewish relations. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Robert. It's mutual. You taught me a lot too. And we both have something in common, obviously, with being discriminated because you're Jewish or you're Black, it doesn't matter. And it all has to do with hate, and that has to stop. We have to do everything possible. And this is what I've been working for the last 25 years to get the message across. Stop the hatred. Simple as that.
I like that. I like that. Stop the hatred. I'm going to write a little piece, man, and send it to you. The title will be "Stop the Hatred." No, but seriously,
absolutely.
That's a good point. I had really focused on. That's very simple. Stop the hatred. Donald Trump, stop the hatred. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
We're an apolitical program.
Right.
We're talking about human decency tonight, and I think hatred should and fighting against hatred crosses all of the political strata. But no, I appreciate you, Dr. Green. Call me later, we'll talk. So one of the common themes that I'm seeing in our question box is what's the difference between now and the 60s? Why? So one of the things that I notice is that there's a schism between the Black and Jewish communities right now, and people are really working on bridging that divide at this point. But in the 60s, it was a tight community. We worked together, as you've spoken about, Dr. Green, and now there's a lot of division, and I believe that when oppressed people are fighting against each other, the only person who wins is the oppressor, right? So, what are strategies to bring us back together?
I think one strategy is to hold discussions as we're doing here tonight. However, there's nothing more powerful in terms of reaching large numbers of young people is our curriculum directors in school districts throughout the country.
Yeah.
The Los Angeles Public Schools, the Chicago Public Schools. What is those public
West Virginia's school district.
Yes, yes. Public school districts. They have public money, they use public funds, and they need to do things to prevent young people from misunderstanding each other. To understand and not misunderstand. And I think teachers can teach in such a way that open-mindedness is looked upon as something we desire, not something that's gonna drive us apart. Knowing about the Holocaust, realizing what that did to so many people makes me more careful about other forms of discrimination. As I said, there's a lot I didn't know. And Ben Lesser educated me to a great extent, but I did know there was discrimination against Jews, don't get me wrong, because you would hear it. As a matter of fact, I was on an airplane flight going across country several years ago, and two men, and they happened to be white males, were sitting behind me. And they got into a discussion about Jews, how terrible Jews were. You know what I did? I pulled the string, the stewardess came, I said, these men behind me are making comments that might be viewed as racial, but they're really anti-religious. And I said, I wish you would ask them to stop. These two men were stunned. They were just, they didn't know what to say. But I said, I'm not going to buy an airplane ticket and let two guys sit behind me and talk about another racial group and not say, they didn't know who I was. They probably thought I was some nut. But the thing is, they were making very strong anti-Semitic comments. Two white males behind me. I couldn't let it go, but I didn't let it go. So we have to be strong enough to speak out. And as Martin Luther King Jr. says, speak out and speak up at the right time.
Absolutely.
I didn't mean to lecture, Robin. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'd like to take that a little bit further. And this is from one of our congregants, Maxine. Thank you for posting in the chat. She would like to know, how do you think that the media influenced the ideology of division between the Jews and the Black community?
And I'd love to hear from Joel and find out what your thoughts are.
Well, one thought I have, it's not addressing the most recent question, but I think for those of us listening tonight who are white Jews like myself, that we have to always remind ourselves of the way history has worked in the United States is that most Jews who came here, and I'm thinking of my grandparents, had the option of becoming white eventually. My grandparents, when they came to the United States, they weren't really white. They were just illiterate Russian peasants. But after a while, they sort of started to understand the calculus of race in America, and my parents more so. And they had that option available to function as white people, whereas the history for African Americans is, or really any person of color in the United States, you don't, if your skin color, if you're brown, you're brown, and you can't optionalize your way out of that. Of course, there are ways you can, through education and many other means, you can advance yourself in society. But I think for, us white Jews who want to be doing progressive work, to really understand that history is extremely important and to, embrace. I'm trying to avoid the word privilege because I think it's a complex and not always good word, but I
appreciate that.
is to acknowledge the own advantages we've had.
Yeah, I want to hear the answer to Maxine's question, but while we're talking to you, Joel, I'd love to know from your perspective in making this documentary, how did it make you feel as you researched, finding out that ideas such as speaking out against lynching were considered anti-American?
I mean, how did, oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Joe. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Dr. Green.
The question was, how did we understand that lynching was anti-American?
So in the documentary, what was talked about was that like Billie Holiday, for instance, when she sung the song, she was always picked up in the clubs and arrested. It will, I don't know if everyone's seen the U.S. versus Billie Holiday on Hulu, that kind of chronicles her experience in singing the song and insisting on singing the song in clubs. And she would be arrested and taken away. And there were lots of issues with that. And it was called Un-American, this song being a protest against lynching. And I hear people say that racism is as American as apple pie. Like what are your thoughts here about racism or lynching specifically, even being and protesting against lynching being anti-American or considered such?
I think, the foundation of this country and the economic underpinnings of this country have always had racial hierarchy behind them. And, the advantage that people have exploited through race, carrying into economic relationships has been incredibly powerful. And that's why those who have that power and that advantage want to preserve it. And I think, I know we've said we're trying to stay political, but I see that through Donald Trump. Racism is as American as apple pie in many ways. It is, that, and that's why we have such deeply embedded systemic racism. So it's not surprising that. At the time I was making the film, there were many surprises, but to find out, for example, that Meeropol was called before the Rapp-Kuder Commission didn't really surprise me that much. He was a radical and he was a communist. And there's always been very powerful forces in America to suppress that and to suppress change of the racial hierarchy that we have.
Yeah. Is anti-Semitism systemic?
I'm
not to put you on the spot. If it's something you need to think about, because it's quite a question, I will acknowledge that.
Yeah, it's one that I'm not sure I want to jump into right away.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about it offline. I'd love to.
I would say mostly it's not, but it's systemic. But I don't want to go further on that one right
Yeah,
now.
Understood. Is anybody else interested in jumping in on that question?
Repeat the question.
Is anti-Semitism systemic?
Is racism systemic?
We know. So is anti-Semitism systemic?
How would you define the systemic?
Yeah.
From an anti-racist standpoint, I would ask that question.
Yeah, creating policies around keeping people out of spaces is a system functioning against groups of people.
I'd like to start off. I'd actually say that it probably was in Europe, but not so much in the United States. And what Joel had said earlier, he hit the nail on the head. You basically, for when you're white, you don't have to show, how did he say it? It was kind of like, when you're Jewish, you don't know what color you are. You're white. People don't know that you're Jewish. When you're African-American, you're Black all day long. And in order to really talk about Judaism and to have any type of that feeling of being prejudiced against, that's when we peel off our onion and we talk about who we are. You can't peel your onion off. So I think that's the difference. So I think it was mostly in Europe, through a systemic plan, the final solution, versus America.
So yeah, and you know, I want to be careful not to Ashka normalize the Jewish experience, because I myself am a Jewish person, so I wear both of those things, one more outwardly than the other. But you know, I've seen Judaism function systemically in CCNRs. If you look back on restrictions, they would say, we don't allow Blacks or Jews in this community, and it's very much codified if you look back in a lot of deeds and documents. So I think certainly in America there were moments of systemic anti-Semitism, and now it looks a bit different. But I appreciate y'all being uncomfortable with that question. That was a bit of a surprise. I'd like to give you all a moment, because we are running out of time here. I'd like to give each of you like a minute or so to wrap up final thoughts and what we experienced here tonight before we close.
I think education is so important. Schools. We took our family to Israel when we 30 years ago. And my kids experienced elementary, middle, and high school in Israel. They had lasting experiences that allowed them to understand the importance of being open-minded. My youngest son, Kevin, when he was 9 or 10 years of age, was fluent in Hebrew. And people were amazed, but that was because of an experience in schools in Jerusalem. So integration, desegregation of schools in America is important. And I definitely would put that at the top of my list, education. Bringing kids together at a very, very early age is so important.
Thank you, Dr. Green.
Dr. Green,
go ahead.
Can I say something? Can you hear me?
We can.
I can hear you, Ben. Yes, sir.
All right. What Dr. Green is saying is preaching the same thing I am. Education, you have to teach, and we have to get these kids today in the school, and we have to get together and perhaps somehow get to the school boards all over the United Nations to get them to start teaching against hatred.
Yes.
Doesn't matter what kind of hate, but they have to start teaching people the histories of what hatred brings, what hatred does to people. And
it does. And you're right. If you teach the lessons of the past, it will definitely prevent for the future generations. And I think that as we can all conclude here, that definitely education is the tie. It's the tie that strings everything together. It's the communication. And with Joel's movie, the documentary Strange Fruit, that is educational, and that is a topic of discussion. It'll definitely brings out more discussions through just from everybody who sees it. And I thank you so much, Joel, for bringing that to us.
Yeah, I'd love to give it
very educational. And so all three of you, Robert, Joel and Ben Lesser. I mean, just through the education and through the eyes of those who actually went through the past to tell us how to live our future is just, thank you.
Thank you. And Joel, I'd like to give you a moment to close.
Oh, okay. Well, rather than trying to conjure some great pearl of wisdom, I'll go more personal with my comments. Is as I said, I completed the film just about 20 years ago. And, one of the stories that it includes is this incredible adoption story of Michael and Robbie Mirapol. And since the film's conclusion, I've become an adoptive parent myself, and we have 2 daughters who are African American. And the elder one of whom is very Jewish identified. So I appreciate your comment about not Ashkenormalizing things, because she's not Ashkenormal. And I've never been to Israel, but she plans to go next year, and perhaps I'll be able to go with her. So.
Thank you.
Love the unity.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, we will definitely have to catch up offline. I want to thank everyone tonight for joining us. I want to give a special thank you to Joel Katz and Robert Green and our surprise guest star, Ben Lesser, tonight for sharing your stories and insight. Thank you also, Ralph Krause of Edutainment, who has been handling all the back end tech stuff. We appreciate you, my friend. And he's just generously given of his time for this event. I'd additionally like to thank Zahra Holocaust Remembrance Foundation for partnering with us for this event tonight. And I couldn't close without thanking the teams working hard behind the scenes of the Social Justice Collective and the Anti-Racism Task Force. Chaplain Jennifer Nye, VOS President Karen Block, VOS Director of Lifelong Learning Carla Adivi, and VOS VP of Education Lori Eisenberg, and of course Frank Baird and Adam Mayer. These teams are incredible, and you've heard about the anti-Semitism or against anti-Semitism task force team earlier tonight, and I thank them again as well. And of course, I want to thank Rabbi Ron Lee Paz for holding the space here at Valley Outreach Synagogue to address these critical issues and his commitment to this work in our community. I want to do some shameless plugs. I learned from the best, Dr. Green, our Shabbat services honoring Yom HaShoah on April 9th will feature guest speaker Ben Lesser. He's a Holocaust survivor and the founder of Zahor Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. The Anti-Racism Task Force is putting on a 4-part weekly workshop on called Awakening to Race. Those will be held on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock, April 21st, 27th, and May 5th and 12th. So look out for registration opportunities for this limited participant event. So spaces will fill up fast, and this is not a recorded event. And lastly, look for information for our first official Against Anti-Semitism Task Force event in May. I want to thank you. I'm excited to be working with you, Robin. You are going to be a rock star on this, chairing this committee. I'm so grateful to be learning from you and to call you a very special friend of mine. With that, yay. Do you want to take us out with a good night, Robin?
Shabbat Shalom. No, it's not Shabbat.
Hag Sameach.
Hag Sameach.
Yeah.
For those who celebrate, happy Passover, and for those who don't, happy Easter that's coming up. We appreciate you all, and this is only a first little tidbit. As you can see from our conversation, it can keep going.
And there's a lot here.
Yes,
Yeah.
But one more thing, I do want to just say thank you to all those who sent a lot of the questions in. We really do appreciate it. If we didn't get to your question, we're just so sorry, but there'll be plenty of other opportunities.